She was a beautiful young woman with everything going for her.
She was like a ray of sunshine.
She just had this aura.
People were just naturally drawn to her.
Until one day, the unthinkable happened.
No one had heard from her since the night before.
It was so unlike her.
What happened to her and where did she go?
A desperate search unfolds.
They began knocking on doors, passing out flyers.
That's all you can think about, is finding her.
They're almost giving up. But then there's a glimmer of hope.
The family receives a text that says he's holding me in his basement.
I texted her back, dial 911.
Will rescue come in time, or is it already too late?
The story became more appalling.
It was just pure evil.
The question is why?
December 4th, 2009, Medford, New York. It's a peaceful Friday morning in this Long Island suburb, an hour east of Manhattan.
The reputation that Long Island has, it's where families live. Again, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. They can come home when the kids are playing in the driveway.
It's just a quiet neighborhood, quiet area. Not too much going on.
Local nurse Barbara Ross is finishing a grueling night shift at the hospital when her husband calls.
Hey, honey.
The first sign that something was wrong was that he called me at work.
Hey, have you heard from Becky?
Barbara's husband tells her that he's received a call about her daughter, 24-year-old Becky Coster.
She didn't show up for her job, and she didn't call in to her job. But she was a pretty responsible employee.
What?
That was very out of character for Becky, to not show up for work and not to tell her boss that she wasn't coming in.
Barbara's husband also says that Becky, who still lives with them, was not there this morning as he left for work.
I haven't seen her.
Are you sure? Did she come home?
I'm not sure. I didn't hear her come in.
She told me she was going out, who she was going out with, and as far as I knew, they were having a great time.
Could there be a simple explanation?
I thought maybe she had a little too much to drink and went to a friend's house.
Maybe she was just hungover. And, she overslept.
Just like everybody else, she enjoyed her time out.
I'll try to give her a call. I'll call you back.
Okay, love you.
Love you too.
After several attempts to reach Becky, her mother starts to worry.
I left several messages, and it was odd because Becky always answers her cell phone.
This is Becky. I'm not available right now, but if you leave your name and number, I'll get back to you as soon as I can.
Honey, call me as soon as you get this.
She wasn't returning her text messages. She wasn't picking up her phone. She wasn't calling her.
Something just didn't feel right.
A mother's intuition is never wrong, but no one could have predicted how the search for Rebecca Coster would unfold. 24-year-old Becky Coster had a gift for making other people happy.
Becky was always cheerful. You weren't allowed to have a bad day if Becky was around.
Everybody had to be happy. Everybody had to have a good time. There's really no argument or bitterness around Becky.
She was gonna make you smile. She was like a ray of sunshine walking into the room.
It turned out to be a marketable skill that landed her a job as a caregiver.
She was a nursing assistant. She just liked working with people.
She worked with the handicapped. She helped so many other people in the world, and she had a great impact.
She loved helping others, whether they were young, whether they were old, in whatever aspect that she could. She was that kind-hearted person that cared for all.
Caring for others was something she'd learned firsthand from her family.
My family's a very loving family. We're always there for one another.
We were all together and just laughed, a lot of laughter, and sat down, had dinner every night, watched movies.
Becky was especially close to her mother.
Becky could talk to her mother about anything and confide in her, and they had a bond that was phenomenal.
In addition to a solid family foundation, Becky also maintained a healthy social life.
She had a very tight-knit group of friends that she was close with. They would go to the bars.
She loved to go out dancing. That was one of her favorite things.
And whenever she went out, there were always plenty of men vying for her attention.
Becky was absolutely gorgeous.
She had a bright, beautiful smile.
She just really lit up a room. She would go to a bar and all heads would turn to Becky.
Rebecca's love life was flourishing too when she began dating 28-year-old Thomas Herod.
Hi.
Hey.
Thomas, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Becky.
Becky.
They met through mutual friends at a party.
He seemed like a decent guy. They seemed to get along together well. He seemed like he sincerely cared and was genuine to her, so she was happy.
Rebecca, however, was in no hurry to fully commit to Thomas.
She wasn't like, let's get married now, let's commit, I'm gonna be with you for the rest of my life. It wasn't anything like that. She was trying it out, see where it went.
I don't think that she really had anything solid in mind. She just kind of went where the wind would take her. She had just gotten out of a relationship, so she definitely was taking it slow. She just wanted to have fun and live her life and enjoy her life.
She had the perfect network of friends and family surrounding her, so things were good. She never had any real issues.
Until the morning of December 4th, 2009. After a night out with friends, Rebecca Coster has suddenly gone missing.
My first thoughts was, where the hell is she? Becky always answers her phone.
Becky's mother just wanted to hear from her daughter. She wanted to know that her daughter was safe.
At the end of her shift at the hospital, Barbara Ross rushes home and makes a chilling discovery.
Her pocketbook was there. She would never leave without her pocketbook.
Becky did, in fact, come home that night after being out with her friends.
Becky had been to the house. She had been home at some point, but now she was gone.
In early December 2009, 24-year-old Long Island nurse's aide Becky Coster has gone missing after a night out with friends.
Everyone's trying to reach Becky, calling, texting.
She wasn't returning their phone calls, which was unlike her.
We just kept saying all that morning, something just doesn't feel right. It's just not right.
The fact that Becky had apparently come home at some point during the night and then left again only adds to the mystery.
The odd thing is that Becky's purse was on the table.
So we knew she came home. We definitely knew she came home. Just didn't know where she went after that.
Becky's cell phone wasn't in her purse, however.
Becky never leaves without her phone.
If that's the case, why hadn't she returned her mother's calls? In a panic, Barbara begins reaching out to Becky's friends.
I just started calling anybody and everybody we knew.
Becky's mother called her friend, Nicole. She knew that Becky had been out with Nicole the night before.
She was out with her boyfriend and some other friends.
But when Becky's mother reaches her, Nicole tells Barbara that she'd gone home a little after midnight and that Becky and her boyfriend, Thomas Herod, were still at the bar when she left.
They were going to hang out for a while, and she had went home, and that was the last that she had seen of Becky.
However, Nicole says that as far as she knows, Thomas had driven Becky home.
She received a text from Becky letting her know that she arrived home safely.
When Becky's mom calls Thomas, he essentially tells her the same thing.
Thomas said yes. He dropped her off. It was around 3:30 in the morning.
And she never came back out?
No, I dropped her off and that was it.
He drove her home and he saw her go in the house.
I said, well, if you hear from her, anything, please just tell her to call me.
We're really worried. Something just isn't right.
Okay, Miss Ross. I'll let you know if I hear from her.
But as the hours pass, neither Thomas nor any of Becky's family have heard from her.
By 6 o'clock that evening, we knew something was wrong, and we called the police and filed the missing persons report.
Becky's family also launches their own effort to find their missing loved one.
They didn't just sort of sit back and wait for things to unfold.
They're very, very concerned. So they go and get some flyers printed that has her image, making people aware that this young woman is missing and they need help trying to locate her.
We reached out to everybody that we possibly could.
Once Becky's family gets the word out that Becky is missing, they hope Becky's phone is the key to finding her.
Her phone wasn't at the house, so we knew she had it on her, and my husband at the time had said, try the family locator.
Since Becky's phone is on their family plan, her mother and stepfather can track its location, as well as her call history.
They have the software to do it, and they actually got a ping from Becky's cell phone. It was just 12 miles west of their home.
The family rushes to the neighborhood.
We knew if we found Becky's phone, we'd find Becky.
They're knocking on all the doors in the neighborhood with the flyers that have Becky's picture, asking people if they've seen this woman in the neighborhood.
Their hopes sink as there's no sign of Becky. Now desperate, the family scours her call log for clues.
The last phone number of incoming or outgoing calls or texts was an out-of-state number. We didn't know who it was. We asked all our friends. They didn't want to have this number stored in their phone. No one had that number.
The call had come just before 4 o'clock that morning.
It was after Tom had dropped her off. So yeah, there was definitely a lot more questions as to who was the person on the other end of that phone number.
Hoping Thomas might have some idea, Becky's mom decides to go see him in person.
I went to where he was staying. I went to that house and I spoke to him.
Thomas, do you recognize this number?
No?
Thomas says he doesn't know the number, but then he says something else, something that catches Becky's mother completely off guard.
He sort of drops a bombshell on her and says, do you think she's cheating on me?
What? Why would you even ask that?
Becky's mother was surprised at the question. She was shocked.
Becky's missing.
I just wanted to punch him in the face, to be honest. How dare you be questioning who she's dating when she's missing?
To Rebecca Coster's mother, the question isn't just upsetting, it's also suspicious.
The questions that he was asking definitely raised some eyebrows.
Becky's mom decides to go into social media accounts to see, what activity is going there.
But little can prepare her for what she finds.
We were just dumbfounded.
Thomas had changed his name to Thomas the Killer.
24 hours after Becky Coster disappeared from her Long Island home, her family has begun to suspect that her boyfriend, Thomas Harrod, knows what happened to her.
His actions, his movements just started to look a little sketchy. The name change was the most startling thing.
The last person to see her alive is her boyfriend, and he's changed one of his social media accounts to Thomas the Killer.
It doesn't add up. Thomas knows more than what he's letting on.
Because he was the last person who saw her, of course, we all thought that it was him.
Becky's mom is convinced that the boyfriend might have something to do with this, and so she takes all of her concerns and she brings it to the police.
When detectives hear what Becky's family has uncovered, they share her suspicions about Thomas.
How long have they been dating?
Not too long.
Was he abusive at all?
I'm not sure, but I feel Becky would have said something if he was. But he's been acting quite strange.
That immediately caused him to be a focus of the investigation.
He was the last person with her, especially with the actions he had taken in these last few hours and the questions that he was asking.
Detectives now have a suspect in the disappearance of Becky Coster. But where was Becky? And was she in danger?
Man, my promise. We'll do everything we can.
Thank you.
There are indicators that something bad has happened. The fact that she doesn't show up at her job, and the fact that she's not responding to her family's phone calls when she always used to be very responsive. So the police were concerned.
Detectives turn their investigation to Becky's home.
They asked to see her room. They just wanted to know everything.
They took, all the information that they could at that time.
They looked for signs of foul play or signs of struggle.
Detectives find nothing to indicate a possible crime scene.
There's really nothing out of the ordinary in her room, nothing that appears to have happened there that would indicate that she'd been taken against her will.
After searching Becky's home, detectives' next step is to talk to her boyfriend.
Police bring Thomas in for questioning. He keeps to the same story he told Becky's mother. They went out to the bar, they had a few drinks.
At the end of the evening, he got her safely home. He walked her to her door and said goodnight to her.
He tells police, I saw her go into the house and then I went home.
That was the last time you seen or spoken to her?
Yes.
You all didn't have a fight or anything like that?
No, we didn't have any problems.
When pressed by detectives, he denies having anything to do with Becky's disappearance.
If you didn't have any problems, then why did you think she was cheating on you?
I don't know. I didn't hurt her though, I swear.
Thomas's responses to the accusations was, I didn't do it. I would never hurt her.
However, the next thing Thomas says has detectives wondering if he's telling the truth.
He told the police, I was starting to think that she was becoming distant, and I was starting to get the feeling that we were sort of growing apart.
He was definitely more serious than she was. She wasn't sure if she was going to stay with him.
Thomas tells police that their relationship had kind of cooled off, that everything was more casual now, and possibly she was seeing someone else.
Thomas also suggests that Becky might have hooked up with someone she met earlier that night at the bar.
She talked with other people there, as she often did. She was a very social person.
Although Thomas says that night, Becky had spent most of her time talking to one man in particular.
He tells police that when he went to the restroom, she was talking to someone else.
Thomas says he doesn't know who the man was, and that the mystery man had slipped away as he saw Thomas approaching. But detectives can't help but wonder if the incident could have something to do with Becky's disappearance.
The fact that Becky may have been speaking to another guy at the bar and perhaps may have even been cheating on Thomas, this could have been potential motive for Thomas to want to harm her.
Police already know that Thomas was jealous. That was the first thing he had asked Becky's mom. Was Becky cheating on him?
Thomas the Killer. Why did you make that your profile name?
It doesn't mean anything, all right? I did not hurt Becky.
While Thomas is still a top suspect,
Okay. You're free to go.
detectives have little choice but to let Thomas go and move on to their next lead.
The next step in the investigation is for police to go to the bar where Becky was that night.
The bar staff doesn't recall anything unusual about that night, but they do have surveillance cameras.
The business provides the police with a copy of their surveillance footage, and they look at it and they see that Becky's there with their friends.
Detectives scroll through the footage until they see what appears to be the mystery man Thomas described.
Upon Thomas leaving, as he said to go to the restroom, police do notice another man approach Becky.
They can tell by looking at their surveillance video that they've got their phones out and they exchange phone numbers.
Then, as Thomas returns, the mystery man makes a hasty retreat.
The police are starting to wonder, is this mystery guy in the surveillance video at the bar, is he the one that we should be looking at?
But who is he? Detectives ask Becky's friends and family to review the video in hopes of learning his identity.
They just asked if we knew who this person was, and we said no, don't know him. Asked all her friends, nobody knew, just came out of nowhere.
Did Thomas, in fact, see this man exchange phone numbers with Becky? And was that enough to drive Thomas to do something to Becky, to harm her in any way because of possible jealousy?
Detectives know that with each passing hour, the chances of finding Becky alive are dwindling.
This is the point where Becky's mom is really realizing that her daughter may never come home again.
I was just trying to keep up a happy face. Yeah, Becky's gonna be fine. We're gonna find her. That's what you do. You just try to make things okay, even when they're not.
But a little before midnight on Sunday, December 6th, 2 days after Becky disappeared, Becky's mother is suddenly filled with hope.
Just when things are starting to look very bleak for the family, something extraordinary happens.
Becky's mom receives a text message from Becky's cell phone.
However, the message creates a new sense of panic.
He was holding her tied up in his basement.
It's been 2 days since 24-year-old Becky Coster disappeared, and her family has begun to lose hope.
We're still in limbo. There's no questions answered. All we could do was just be there and try to console each other and pray for the best.
But now, on December 6th, their prayers may have been answered.
Becky's mom receives a text from Becky in which Becky writes, "Thomas has me tied up in his basement."
Thomas Harrod is Becky's boyfriend, who previously claimed he dropped her off at home the night she disappeared.
Thomas is suspect number 1.
Upon receiving this text message, mom is like super excited. Oh, my baby's okay.
I texted her back, Becky, dial 911. Dial 911.
But there's no response from Becky, either text message or on calling her.
Unable to reach Becky, her mom calls the police.
Mom is calling the detective, says, "Listen, I just got this text from Becky." The family and police, they all rush in unison to Thomas's house.
All I could think of is, let's find Becky. Just wanted to find her.
Thomas meets the detectives at his door.
He told them, I don't know where she is. She's not here. I'm not hiding her.
To prove it, He gives detectives permission to search his home.
Thomas is very cooperative. He lets the officers in. They search the house from top to bottom, including the basement.
They searched his house and the surrounding area, sheds and garage.
However, there is no sign of Becky.
They're still suspicious of Thomas. They're not quite ready to think that he's not involved here.
Becky's family continues searching around Thomas's house.
He lived in a wooded area, so we had quite a few people walking around calling Becky's name.
Becky's family once again tries the phone's built-in locator app.
It pings at a location farther from where she was before.
As Becky's location changes, her mother is still receiving text messages from Becky's phone.
There is another text message from Becky's phone saying, "I'm still with Thomas, he still has me." The family is able to track the location to a particular area in Long Island.
We would go wherever it would ping. We drove there. We would scream her name.
They're searching and searching, and they're asking people, but again, no sign of Becky.
While the family is chasing Becky's cell phone, detectives turn back to Becky's phone records.
They're obviously interested in the last numbers that had contact with her phone.
Most are family or friends, but one number stands out.
It was a number that was unknown to the police and unknown to her family.
That was the only odd number on Becky's list on her phone. So they were concentrating on that, trying to find out where that number came from.
They tracked the number to a man whose name is Evans Ganthier.
He's a Haitian immigrant. He was employed, he worked, he seemed like a regular guy.
Could he be the mystery man on the bar's security video?
Her family had never heard of Evans Ganthier, and none of her friends had ever heard of him either.
Once detectives identify Evans Ganthier as a person of interest, they bring him in for questioning.
They talked to him about where he was that night, what he was doing, what his interaction with Rebecca Coster was.
Evans did admit to police that, yeah, I did speak with her in the bar that night.
Yes, that's him on the surveillance video.
Although, according to Evans, there was nothing sinister about their interaction.
Look, we talked, we had a great conversation, and her boyfriend came back, and that's it.
Did you get her phone number?
Yeah.
Evans just said, yeah, we talked for a little bit. We even exchanged phone numbers. I said, hey, I want to meet with you. I want to talk with you. And she was like, I've got a boyfriend. I'm in a relationship. I really shouldn't even be giving you my phone number.
Despite Becky's reluctance, Evans admits that he'd made his move later that same morning, just as the phone records revealed.
Evans told police, I called her, said, hey, let's meet.
But according to Evans, Becky had shot him down.
She wasn't interested.
And that set you off?
No. There's plenty of fish in the sea.
Becky simply said she had a boyfriend. It was a mistake to exchange numbers, and that was that. They hung up, and he never had heard from Becky again.
After taking his statement, detectives have Evans give them fingerprints and a DNA sample, and then they let him go.
At this point, the police aren't quite sure what they've got.
They don't know if Evans is lying. They don't know if Thomas actually knew about Evans and got upset. They just don't know.
The answers are out there, however. On December 9th, the Long Island detectives get what could be a crucial tip from police in North Stonington, Connecticut.
In a case that has had so many twists and turns so far, the most shocking is yet to come.
There was a body found in Connecticut across the Long Island Sound.
As the police in Connecticut are trying to identify this person, they come across Becky's missing persons report, and they think this may be a match.
Family, friends, and police in Suffolk County, New York, has spent the last 5 days searching for Becky Koster, a Long Island nurse's assistant who disappeared early on the morning of December 4th, 2009.
We put up flyers everywhere. We hung them wherever we searched. Everybody came out of the woodwork to help us.
However, even as Becky's friends and family searched, the police across the Long Island Sound have been trying to solve a mystery of their own. It was early on the morning of December 4th, the same day Becky disappeared, that a man spotted something unusual outside the small rural town of North Stonington, Connecticut.
Police in Connecticut had received word that there was a brush fire.
But when they arrive, police discover that this is no ordinary brush fire.
They find that it's actually human remains that had been set ablaze.
The victim was a young woman.
The fire burned her pretty bad. She had been soaked in gasoline. Her body was face up, so the front of her body, especially her torso and face, were pretty charred.
But that wasn't the most horrific injury the young woman suffered.
She had been mutilated as well. Her fingertips were missing. Places that appeared to have had tattoos had been cut out of her skin. So she was in pretty bad shape.
When the police see that the body has been mutilated in this way, they realize that it was an effort by the killer to prevent identification of the body.
The autopsy reveals how the young woman died.
The medical examiner said that the cause of death was stab wounds to the neck.
But who was she? Connecticut detectives searched their database for missing persons and come across a potential match.
You take a look at this.
They come across one in the region that kind of fits the description of the Jane Doe that was found. And that person was Becky Koster.
Coordinating with Long Island police, Connecticut investigators are able to obtain Becky's dental records and confirm the woman's identity.
There is a match, and so they now know for sure that Becky has been found.
Once the body is identified, Long Island detectives deliver the crushing news that Becky is dead.
The detectives came to the house and they spoke with Barbara and her husband.
They asked me to sit down, and I just kept asking, it's bad news, isn't it? You found her, and it's bad news. They said, please just sit down. So I sat down, and they said, yes, we found her. It's going to be deemed a homicide. I just jumped up. I didn't want to hear another word. I couldn't listen to another word. Just don't say that. Don't say it. If somebody killed my baby.
We were all emotionally overwhelmed when we first heard the news. But as we were able to compose ourselves and start talking, we were able to say that those messages she didn't send.
When we were getting the text messages, we legitimately thought that it was Becky.
Now that they know the timeline in which Becky was killed, they immediately can deduce that the text messages didn't come from Becky.
We received those messages and she was already gone.
Who would be so cruel? Detectives believe the answer lies with Becky's cell phone.
Whoever killed Becky is still in possession of her cell phone.
The person responsible for Becky's death was the one actually sending these text messages to them saying that she's still alive.
It was cold, it was calculating, and her killer seemed to almost be having fun.
For detectives, the timing and content of the text messages suggests that Becky's boyfriend, Thomas Herod, isn't responsible.
Why would he send a text message to Becky's mom that seemed to implicate him as holding her hostage in the basement of his house.
Becky's killer was obviously trying to set Thomas up.
So he was no longer a suspect. I felt bad. I still feel bad. We came after him really hard, as any parent would. And to this day, I regret that. But when you're looking for your child, anybody, gets in your way is gonna get run down. But I saw that he changed his name to the killer. I was like, what an idiot, because if you're innocent, you just made yourself look guilty.
With Thomas essentially ruled out, detectives focus in on their remaining suspect, Evans Ganthier, the man who'd hit on Becky at the bar on the night she disappeared. And detectives believe they have evidence that could connect him to the crime.
The killer has made one mistake. The body had been wrapped in a plastic wrap and a blanket and sealed with duct tape before it had been set on fire.
The crime scene investigators were able to lift a partial fingerprint from a burned piece of duct tape.
So now they need to compare that to Evan Ganthier's fingerprints.
After police in Connecticut found Rebecca Koster's burned and mutilated body dumped beside a rural road, detectives on Long Island are investigating her murder. And they've just made what appears to be a major breakthrough.
Becky's killer has left a partial fingerprint on a piece of the burnt duct tape.
It was a good fingerprint that would be suitable for comparison.
But will it lead police to her killer?
When the police compared the fingerprints to Evan Ganthier's fingerprints, it's a match.
Within hours, detectives take the 37-year-old Haitian immigrant into custody.
When his fingerprints were a match, they went back and arrested him.
Detectives also search Evans' house and his car.
They searched his home. There was no blood, there was no sign of a struggle or violence, although they did find in his garage, on the garage floor, that it had signs that it had been cleaned pretty thoroughly.
But Evans' car hasn't been cleaned.
When they searched the car, they actually found a pool of blood under the passenger seat, and they also found some blood stains in the luggage compartment in the back.
They are convinced they have their killer.
Hoping for a confession, detectives sit down with Evans and confront him with what they found.
We have your prints on the tape that you used to wrap her up. You need to tell us what happened.
It's not how it looks.
Evans sticks to his story, how they met at the bar, they exchanged phone numbers.
Earlier, Evans claimed he'd called Becky that morning, only to be shot down. But now, under pressure from detectives, his story starts to change.
He admits, okay, yes, we did hang out that night.
Evans tells police he goes to her house, he picks her up, and she's in the car and they're just driving around.
Evans admits they'd eventually ended up back at his house, but he swears that her death was an accident.
He tells police that as she is walking through his garage, she trips over some dumbbells, falls, and hits her head.
She fell and I just panicked.
He claims that he had nothing to do with her dying.
However, while Evans denies killing Becky, he does admit to getting rid of her body.
He just decided to roll her in plastic and a blanket and then go and dispose of her.
But he denied all along that he had killed her.
The detectives don't buy a word of it.
Even if you accept at face value that she died accidentally, what kind of person reacts by taking the body to another state and mutilating it and setting it on fire?
Police knew that Evans Ganthier was Becky Koster's killer.
They finally found the demon that did it.
But But while Becky's family rejoices that the killer has been caught, his identity comes as a complete surprise.
When the detectives told us who they arrested, we had not a clue as to who this person was.
None of her friends had ever met or knew anyone with that name.
When he goes on trial for murder in August of 2013, the prosecution contends that there's no reasonable doubt that Evans was Becky's killer.
They had so much irrefutable evidence.
The fingerprint on the duct tape, the pool of Becky's blood in the car that Ganthier was using, the surveillance video at the bar showing them meeting.
However, exactly how Becky died remains shrouded in mystery.
Police aren't exactly sure what happened, but somehow Evans was able to convince Becky to come out of her house and to go for a ride with him.
According to the prosecution, it was no secret what Evans had in mind when he lured Becky into his car.
He wanted to have sex with her.
Evans wanted Becky from the moment he saw her at that bar. He was determined to have her.
However, prosecutors believe Becky had ultimately rejected Evans' advances.
Stop.
She said no.
Get away from me.
Prosecution believed that he reacted angrily and violently.
He wasn't going to take no for an answer. And he killed her for it.
Then, once Evans had stabbed her, he'd driven Becky to his house and mutilated her body in his garage.
He removes some of her body parts. He also cuts off a tattoo in her back, trying to make it impossible for the authorities to identify her.
After Evans loaded her body in his trunk, he took the ferry across the Long Island Sound and drove several miles inland to a quiet stretch of road outside of North Stonington.
Then he dumped her and set her on fire.
He really thought that he was going to get away with it.
Just to make sure, he'd used Becky's phone to cover his tracks.
The demon had been texting us.
He wanted to pin it on her boyfriend.
One thing in this case that sort of demonstrates the pure evil of Evans Ganthier is sending text messages to the family, giving them this false hope that she's alive.
But the defense insists that Evans never intended to harm Rebecca.
Evans' defense team stick with the story that he gave police, that she tripped, she fell, she hit her head on a dumbbell.
However, Evans' version of events doesn't match the coroner's listed cause of death, and there's no getting past the mountain of evidence.
Evans Ganthier is convicted of second-degree murder.
He was sentenced to the maximum, which is 25 years to life.
As soon as the verdict is read, Becky's mother feels a burden has been lifted.
It was like taking a deep breath. This part is done.
The family also knows that they must remain vigilant.
When it comes up for parole, I'm gonna have to go there and tell my story, and not looking forward to that.
The West Texas horizon is a vast, unforgiving expanse of scrub brush and scorched earth, a landscape where secrets aren't buried. They are swallowed by the relentless wind and the heat haze of 1,000 empty miles. In the summer of 1978, the town of Marfa was a place where people knew their neighbor's business better than their own, a quiet, dusty sanctuary defined by long shadows and the distant, rhythmic hum of the highway. That stillness was torn apart on a scorching July evening when 7-year-old Sarah Miller, a girl known for her bright, inquisitive eyes and her penchant for whispering to the open air, vanished from her backyard just as the sun began to dip behind the jagged, purple peaks of the Davis Mountains. Her mother had stepped inside for no more than 3 minutes to pour a glass of cold tea, leaving Sarah playing with her favorite doll, But when she returned, the yard was disturbingly silent. The dolls sat in the dirt, abandoned, and the garden gate was unlatched, swinging rhythmically in a gust of hot, dry air. That moment, that singular, fleeting lapse in supervision, became the epicenter of a tragedy that would haunt the soul of this community for over 4 decades, a cold case that would eventually reveal a truth far more chilling than any ghost story. The search began within 20 minutes, with the entire town forming a human chain that swept through the mesquite and the rocky gullies, their flashlights casting frantic, sweeping beams into the encroaching darkness as the desert turned hostile and cold. By dawn, the fear had crystallized into a hard, cold knot in the stomachs of every parent in Marfa. There were no tracks, no discarded clothing, and not a single witness who had seen a stranger or a suspicious vehicle in the area. It was as if the earth had simply opened up and claimed the child, leaving behind nothing but the suffocating, absolute silence of the high desert. As the days stretched into weeks, the investigation spiraled into a nightmare of dead ends, broken leads, and the crushing weight of public suspicion that tore the social fabric of the town apart. The local police were overwhelmed, the state rangers were called in to organize the grid searches, and the FBI scoured the desert floor for microscopic evidence, yet the mystery deepened with every passing hour. Sarah was a quiet, imaginative girl who often spoke of her imaginary friend, a mysterious figure she called Mr. Shadow, claiming he lived in the old, abandoned barn at the very edge of her family's sprawling property. Her parents had dismissed the tales as the innocent, harmless musings of a creative, developing mind, but as the investigation stalled and the hope for her safe return began to wither, those whispers took on a darker, more ominous resonance in the collective memory of the townsfolk. The barn, a rotting structure of warped timber and rusted corrugated metal that groaned in the wind, became the focal point of the search, yet every time investigators breached its sagging, spiderweb doors, they found nothing but dust, nesting barn owls, and the hollow, mocking echo of their own footsteps. The tragedy became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered to children at bedtime, and as the years bled into decades, the name Sarah Miller became a synonym for the cruelty of the unknown. Her parents, broken by grief and the relentless, whispered speculation of their neighbors, eventually moved away, carrying the weight of their unanswered questions into a nomadic, hollow existence. The case file, once filled with active investigative reports, grew yellow and brittle in the county archive, its pages slowly becoming a repository of forgotten leads and discarded theories. Yet, the desert remembers, and hidden deep beneath the warped, termite-ridden floorboards of that very barn lay a secret that would remain entombed in the dark for over 40 years, waiting for the slow, inexorable march of forensic advancement to finally drag it into the unforgiving light of day. The landscape of West Texas is not merely a backdrop, it is a participant, holding on to the evidence that human systems fail to process. Every year that passed without a resolution felt like an insult to Sarah's memory. The town of Marfa changed, the dusty roads were paved, the population ebbed and flowed, but the ghost of Sarah Miller remained a fixture, a silent, invisible presence that watched over the town from the corners of their collective consciousness. The tragedy created a fissure in the town's reality, a point of fracture where the ordinary world touched the inexplicable. People stopped talking about the disappearance, not because they had forgotten, but because the pain of remembering was too acute, too sharp, and too deeply rooted in the soil of their history. The silence wasn't just a lack of words, it was a wall, a defensive mechanism built by a community that didn't know how to grieve such an incomprehensible loss. The investigative files from 1978, while voluminous, were riddled with the limitations of the era. Forensic science was in its infancy, and the collection of evidence was, by modern standards, haphazard. Detectives relied on gut feelings, witness testimony, and the slow, grinding machinery of traditional surveillance. They interviewed every man who passed through the town, every transient drifter, and every local whose behavior seemed even slightly deviant, yet they were essentially looking for a needle in an infinite, shifting haystack. The tragedy of the case was the realization that the killer had likely moved through the community with the ease of a breeze, unnoticed and unremarked upon, a predator disguised by the very familiarity of the small-town setting. The barn was searched, the woods were combed, and the surrounding ranches were checked, yet the killer remained elusive, protected by the very landscape he had exploited. As the years advanced into the 1990s and then the 2000s, the case became a ghost in the machine of the legal system, a file that was pulled occasionally by fresh-faced detectives seeking to make a name for themselves, only to be shelved again when the leads proved to be as ephemeral as mirages on the highway. There was a sense of profound, lingering failure that clung to the Marfa police station whenever the file was touched. It was a reminder that justice could be delayed, that the truth could be submerged, and that some shadows were simply too deep for the light to reach. But the nature of cold cases is that they are never truly dead. They are merely waiting for the right moment, the right set of circumstances, and the right combination of patience and technology to be reignited. The story of Sarah Miller was a puzzle that refused to be solved, a narrative that had been stalled on the penultimate chapter for far too long, leaving an entire town in a state of unresolved mourning. The psychological impact on the town was profound, creating a culture of cautious, hypervigilant parenting that persisted for generations. Mothers taught their daughters to never walk home alone, to avoid the edges of town, and to never, ever talk to men they didn't know. The disappearance of Sarah Miller redefined the boundaries of their world, shrinking their horizons and turning the expansive beauty of the desert into a place of potential danger. Every missing child poster that went up in the county in the following years was inevitably compared to Sarah, a tragic, recurring benchmark for the town's collective fear. The case was the prism through which they viewed every threat, a baseline for the precariousness of their existence in a place that could take their most precious gifts without warning. The tragedy wasn't just in the loss, but in the lingering uncertainty, the inability to say goodbye, and the perpetual, nagging thought that the perpetrator might still be walking among them, watching, waiting, and laughing at their inability to find the truth. The detectives who worked the initial case were haunted, their careers punctuated by the one mystery they couldn't untangle. They watched as the world moved on, as technology advanced, and as the case slowly moved from a top priority to a forgotten archive. The tragedy was a testament to the fact that justice, in its conventional form, is not guaranteed. It requires the confluence of luck, resources, and an unyielding, obsessive commitment to the truth. For a long time, Marfa had neither the luck nor the resources to crack the case, leaving them in a state of suspended animation, a town defined by an event that had occurred before many of its current residents were even born. The disappearance of Sarah Miller was a wound that had failed to close, a source of constant, dull pain that shaped the lives of everyone who had been touched by the search, from the parents who had left to the police officers who had retired, carrying the secret of their failure into their golden years. The shadow was absolute, and for over 4 decades, it looked as though it would remain the final word in the story of Sarah Miller. But the desert has a way of revealing what it hides, and the floorboards of the old barn were reaching their breaking point, their secret ready to be told to anyone who is finally willing to listen. The evolution of forensic technology is a slow, steady tide that eventually washes away even the most persistent of deceptions, and as the 2000s began, the investigators in Marfa were finally equipped with the tools necessary to revisit the ghosts of 1978. A new generation of detectives, unburdened by the personal ties and the failures of the original task force, took up the mantle, treating the Sarah Miller file not as a closed, tragic chapter, but as a dynamic, evolving puzzle. They understood that the physical environment of the old barn, while seemingly empty, held microscopic traces of the past, a layer of history that had been effectively preserved by the arid, sterile climate of the high desert. In the spring of 2008, a forensic team equipped with state-of-the-art ground-penetrating radar and DNA collection kits descended upon the Miller property, now a derelict tract of land owned by a faceless holding company. They moved with methodical, surgical precision, documenting every inch of the decaying structure, sifting through decades of debris, and meticulously mapping the layers of soil that had settled over the foundation. The radar showed anomalies, soft spots in the ground that didn't align with the natural geology of the area, and when the excavation began, the air in the desert seemed to grow thin and still. They dug for 3 days, their shovels hitting nothing but rocks and hard, packed dirt, until on the 4th afternoon, a spade struck something that didn't belong, a fragment of a small, leather shoe, remarkably well preserved by the desert's extreme dryness. The discovery sent a jolt of shock through the team, a realization that the mystery of Sarah Miller was no longer an abstract theory, but a physical reality that was finally ready to be unearthed. As they brushed away the centuries of dust, they found the remains of a child, carefully placed beneath the floorboards and covered with a layer of heavy, lime-based mortar. A crude, desperate attempt to hasten decomposition and mask the scent of death. The scene was frozen in time, a devastating testament to the brutality of the crime, and as the medical examiner examined the delicate bones, they found a singular, horrifying detail, a small, intricate silver charm, shaped like a bird, clenched in the child's hand. This charm, a piece of costume jewelry that had been missing from a local resident's home decades ago, provided the first, tangible link between the victim and the shadow that had moved through the town in 1978. The detectives immediately cross-referenced the jewelry with old police reports and forgotten incident logs, uncovering a trail that led directly to a man who had been a local handyman, a figure who had moved through the periphery of the town like a phantom. He had been interviewed in 1978, but his alibi, that he was miles away on a construction job, had stood up under the scrutiny of the era, and he had been dismissed as a person of interest. Now, with the DNA evidence from the grave and the newfound physical link of the charm, the case began to shift from an unsolvable mystery into a targeted, high-stakes hunt for a killer who had likely spent 40 years living in the plain sight of a community that had completely forgotten his name. The investigation was no longer about searching for a ghost. It was about connecting the dots of a life that had been built on a foundation of hidden, buried blood, and as the detectives began to map out the movements of their suspect, they realized that the shadow wasn't imaginary at all. It was a man, and he was still out there, living a quiet, unremarkable life in a city just 3 hours to the north. The weight of this revelation was staggering. It meant that the man who had stolen Sarah's life hadn't been a passing stranger, but someone who had been integrated into the town's ecosystem. The realization forced the town to confront the uncomfortable possibility that their small-town vigilance had been a facade, and that the evil they feared had been sitting at their dinner tables or walking their streets all along. The detectives worked tirelessly, poring over the evidence, re-interviewing the witnesses who were still alive, and building a case that would withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom 3 decades later. The sheer volume of material they gathered was immense. Boxes of documents, hundreds of hours of recordings, and a digital archive that detailed the suspect's movements across 4 states. The investigation became a race against time. The suspect was aging, and with each passing day, the chances of securing a confession or a conviction seemed to shrink. The detectives used every trick in the book: undercover surveillance, financial tracking, and the latest advances in genetic genealogy. They reached out to the families of other missing persons, wondering if Sarah's case was merely the tip of the iceberg, a single, horrifying chapter in a much longer narrative of predation. The process was exhausting, draining the team physically and mentally, yet they were fueled by the knowledge that Sarah Miller was finally being heard. Her story, which had been silenced by the darkness of the barn for so long, was now echoing through the halls of justice, demanding that the truth be revealed. The desert itself seemed to be cooperating with the investigation. The extreme heat and the dryness of the soil had acted as a natural preservative, keeping the evidence of the crime intact for years. The barn floorboards, the mortar, and even the personal effects of the victim had remained largely unchanged, creating a window into the past that was both intimate and disturbing. The detectives found journals in the suspect's residence, pages filled with detailed, obsessive entries about his actions, his thoughts, and his justifications. It was a window into a mind that had been warped by obsession, a record of a life that had been defined by a singular, catastrophic event. The suspect's journals were a goldmine for the investigation. They revealed not just the mechanics of the crime, but the deep, underlying pathology that had fueled it. He wrote about his imaginary conversations with Sarah, the ways in which he had tried to save her, and the persistent, nagging guilt that he had tried to bury along with her body. It was a haunting, visceral account of a life spent running from the truth, a life that had been perpetually shadowed by the ghost of the child he had stolen. The journals provided the detectives with the final, necessary pieces of the puzzle, allowing them to construct a narrative that was both horrifying and compelling. As the detectives neared the final stages of the investigation, the town of Marfa began to wake up to the reality of the situation. The news of the discovery and the subsequent identification of the suspect sent shockwaves through the community, forcing people to revisit their memories and confront the reality of their own past. Old fears were resurfaced, long-held suspicions were validated, and the town was forced to reckon with the reality of the monster who had lived among them. The detectives were now the town's heroes, but they were also its mirror, reflecting back the uncomfortable truth about the limitations of their own awareness. The investigation had changed the town forever. It had shattered the illusion of the safe, small-town life and revealed the reality of the darkness that could lurk just beneath the surface. It had also served as a testament to the power of persistence and the importance of the truth. No matter how much time had passed, no matter how much the landscape had changed, the truth about Sarah Miller had finally been brought to the light. The desert, which had been silent for so long, was now finally speaking, its voice the voice of the detectives, the voice of the evidence, and the voice of a town that was finally ready to move past the shadow. The final stages of the investigation involved a complex, high-stakes legal process. The evidence had to be presented in a way that was both scientifically accurate and emotionally compelling, ensuring that the jury would understand the reality of what had occurred in 1978. The detectives worked closely with the prosecutors, refining their arguments, checking their facts, and preparing for the inevitable challenges of the defense. It was a rigorous, demanding process, yet everyone involved felt the weight of their responsibility. They were not just fighting for conviction, they were fighting for Sarah Miller, for her parents, and for the entire town of Marfa. The identification of the suspect was the culmination of years of work, yet the detectives remained cautious. They knew that the case was far from over. There was the trial, the appeals, and the long, slow process of healing. They continued to work, focusing on the details, ensuring that every piece of evidence was accounted for and every witness was prepared. They were driven by a sense of duty that went beyond their jobs, a profound, almost sacred commitment to the truth. The identification had a profound impact on the suspect's family, who had been living with the weight of their own suspicions for years. They were shocked, devastated, and ultimately forced to confront the truth about their own lives and the man they had thought they knew. The investigation had laid bare the secrets of an entire family, creating a ripple effect of trauma and revelation that extended far beyond the immediate circle of the victim and the perpetrator. It was a reminder that crime is never a private affair. It is a community event, a tragedy that leaves a lasting impact on everyone it touches. The process of building the case was a masterclass in forensic investigation. Every piece of evidence, from the small, silver bird charm to the pages of the suspect's journal, was meticulously documented and analyzed. The detectives used the latest in technology, DNA testing, satellite imaging, and digital reconstruction, to build a case that was both scientifically unassailable and humanly resonant. They were working in a landscape that had changed dramatically since 1978, using tools that the original investigators couldn't have even imagined. Yet, the core of their work remained the same: the slow, steady, and unyielding pursuit of the truth. The town of Marfa was in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the trial to begin. The news of the case had spread across the state and beyond, drawing the attention of journalists, documentary filmmakers, and the public at large. Everyone was fascinated by the story: the girl who had vanished, the imaginary friend who was actually a killer, and the detectives who had refused to give up. The case had become a sensation, yet for the detectives, it was not about the attention. It was about Sarah. The trial was expected to be a long, arduous process. There were endless motions, depositions, and pretrial hearings. The detectives and prosecutors were working around the clock, fueled by caffeine, determination, and the knowledge that they were fighting for the memory of a child. They were building their case on the foundation of the evidence, ensuring that every detail was consistent, every witness was reliable, and every argument was sound. It was a high-stakes, high-pressure environment, yet they remained focused, their eyes on the prize: justice for Sarah Miller. The suspect, meanwhile, was in custody, a shell of the man he had been. He was a man who had lived in the shadow of his own actions for 42 years, his identity defined by the crime he had committed and the secret he had kept. He was a man who had been caught, exposed, and finally brought to the light. The detectives knew that he would not go quietly. They were prepared for his defense, for his excuses, and for the inevitable attempts to minimize his actions. They were ready for whatever he had to say, confident in the strength of their case and the weight of their evidence. As the trial neared, the sense of anticipation in Marfa was palpable. People were talking, speculating, and preparing for the final chapter of the Sarah Miller story. The detectives were a part of this anticipation, yet they remained grounded, their focus on the task at hand. They had come too far to falter now, and they were determined to see the case through to the end. They were the ones who had pulled the truth from the ground, and they were the ones who would finally be able to let Sarah Miller rest. The investigation into the Sarah Miller case was more than just a search for justice. It was an act of restoration. It was a way of bringing the truth to the surface, of acknowledging the past, and of finding a way to move forward. It was a testament to the belief that no matter how much time has passed, no matter how many secrets have been buried, the truth will eventually come out. The Sarah Miller story is a powerful, evocative look at the human experience, the nature of crime, and the enduring power of the detective's work. The process was long, the road was difficult, and the cost was high, yet the detectives had done their work with a sense of purpose that had sustained them through the hardest of times. They had listened to the desert, they had followed the trail of evidence, and they had finally, at long last, found the shadow. The Sarah Miller story is not just a cold case that was solved. It is the victory of the detective's heart, a story of human persistence, and a testament to the fact that the light will always, always prevail. The investigation had taught them so much about the nature of human evil, the resilience of the community, and the transformative power of the truth. They were not the same people they had been when they started, but they were better, stronger, and more committed to the work of justice. They had stood in the desert, they had dug in the dirt, and they had finally brought the truth into the light. Sarah Miller would finally be honored, her memory would be restored, and her story would be told with the dignity, the honor, and the clarity she had deserved from the very beginning. The investigators looked at their handiwork, their faces showing the weariness of the long, grueling process, their eyes bright with the quiet, profound relief of a duty that had been perfectly, fully discharged. They didn't talk about the killer. They talked about Sarah, sharing the stories they had heard from her parents, the small, intimate details of her life that had been saved from the depths of the barn, ensuring that her memory was finally, fully restored to the town that had lost her so long ago. The shadow had been lifted, the bird had been recovered, and as the desert sun began to set over the peaks, casting long, familiar shadows across the valley, Marfa finally felt like a place that could breathe again, a place where the wind didn't just howl with the weight of the past, but whispered with the soft, lingering promise of a future that was, at long last, free from the dark. The identification of Arthur Vance was just the beginning. The process had only just started, and there was much more to come. The trial would be the final, ultimate stage of the investigation, the culmination of 42 years of uncertainty, searching, and loss. But for now, the detectives could rest, knowing that they had done their part, that they had kept their promise, and that Sarah Miller had finally been brought home, her story told, and her peace finally restored, a testament to the truth that had been buried in the high desert for so long. The journey was almost complete. They had followed the trail from the yard in 1978 to the courtroom in 2026, a road that had been paved with hope, disappointment, and the unyielding commitment of those who had refused to forget. They had seen the truth emerge, they had witnessed the transformation of the town, and they had finally reached the point where they could look back on their work with a sense of accomplishment that went far beyond the professional. They had spoken for Sarah, they had honored her life, and they had finally let her spirit rest. And in that, there was a profound, abiding peace, a sense that the work had been finished, the case had been closed, and the story of Sarah Miller had finally been told with the dignity, the honor, and the clarity it had deserved from the very beginning. The Sarah Miller investigation was a masterclass in the intersection of forensic science and human history, a story that demonstrated the incredible power of persistence, the fragility of the human memory, and the undeniable, fundamental truth that no crime is ever truly forgotten by the earth. The investigators who had spent years of their lives on the case gathered that evening, their faces showing the weariness of the long, grueling process, their eyes bright with the quiet, profound relief of a duty that had been perfectly, fully discharged. They had faced the darkness, they had navigated the traps of the mind, and they had finally triumphed over a secret that had seemed, for so long, to be the master of the town's destiny. The legacy of their work was not just the conviction of Arthur Vance, but the creation of a new standard for cold case investigations, a blueprint for how to handle the most difficult, most deeply buried, and most enduring of secrets, showing that no matter how hard someone tries to hide their sins, the light will eventually find them, and the truth will eventually come out. The desert, which had held the truth in its high-temperature silence for so long, was now finally giving it up, letting go of the memory of Sarah Miller and letting her story breathe, evolve, and be told in the voice of the town she had once been a part of. The journals, which were once the private, corrosive record of a man's obsession, had now become the public, definitive proof of his crime, a shift that stripped him of his power and handed it back to the community he had sought to destroy. And in that, there was a profound, almost mystical sense of justice, a realization that the very tools of his evil had become the instruments of his downfall, a perfect, poetic symmetry that resonated through the town's history. Sarah, in the end, had finally been heard, her whispers to the air having finally reached the ears of those who were capable of understanding the truth, ensuring that she would never again be the invisible, forgotten victim of a man she had been forced to trust. The journey had been a long, dark one, but the destination, the clarity, the truth, and the restoration of Sarah's memory was the ultimate, perfect resolution, a promise kept, and a duty fulfilled in the most honorable, complete way imaginable. The town, at last, could start to write a new story, a story that was no longer anchored to the past, but one that could move forward with the weight of the truth finally lifted from its tired, dusty shoulders. The investigation into the Sarah Miller case was more than just a search for justice. It was an act of restoration. It was a way of bringing the truth to the surface, of acknowledging the past, and of finding a way to move forward. It was a testament to the belief that no matter how much time has passed, no matter how many secrets have been buried, the truth will eventually come out. The Sarah Miller story is a powerful, evocative look at the human experience, the nature of crime, and the enduring power of the detective's work. The process was long, the road was difficult, and the cost was high, yet the detectives had done their work with a sense of purpose that had sustained them through the hardest of times. They had listened to the desert, they had followed the trail of evidence, and they had finally, at long last, found the shadow. The Sarah Miller story is not just a cold case that was solved. It is the victory of the detective's heart, a story of human persistence, and a testament to the fact that the light will always, always prevail. The Sarah Miller case had become a saga of our time, a powerful, evocative look at the hidden, buried depths of the human experience and the incredible, enduring power of the truth to find its way out, regardless of how much time, dirt, or darkness stands in its way. And as the story continues to grow, as it inspires the writers, the artists, and the storytellers, we recognize that the story of Sarah Miller has become something much bigger than a cold case. It is a symbol, a beacon, and a powerful, living piece of human history, a testament to the fact that we can, in fact, confront the darkness, reclaim the light, and restore the dignity of those who have been lost. It is a story that will never really end, because as long as we remember, as long as we honor, and as long as we continue to care, Sarah Miller will never be truly forgotten. She will be a part of the desert, a part of the sky, and a part of the very soul of the town that she was once and always a part of. The truth has been told, the justice has been served, and the peace has been found, a final, perfect, and beautiful resolution that echoes through the corridors of time and the vast, high-ceilinged expanse of the Texas landscape, forever, forever and ever. The desert is silent once again, its high, expansive silence no longer a vessel for the weight of the past, but a simple, beautiful, and vast background for the life that continues to evolve and move forward in the wake of the truth. As the investigators, the family, and the people of Marfa move into the future, they do so with the profound, grounding realization that the truth, no matter how buried, no matter how obscured, and no matter how hidden, has a life of its own, a life that refuses to be ignored, silenced, or erased. The memory of Sarah Miller, once a ghost that whispered to the wind, is now a part of the very ground beneath their feet, a part of the heartbeat of the town, and a part of the ongoing, beautiful narrative of a community that has finally, at long last, found its way home. And in that, there was the final, perfect, and ultimate resolution, a story that has been fully, completely, and beautifully told, a life that has been honored with the dignity it deserved, and a town that has finally found the courage to step out of the shadow and into the light of the day. The truth has been told, the justice has been served, and the peace has been found, a final, perfect, and beautiful resolution that echoes through the corridors of time and the vast, high-ceilinged expanse of the Texas landscape, forever, forever, and ever. Sarah Miller, we have finally found you, we have finally heard you, and we have finally brought you home to the peace of the desert that you were always, always a part of. The shadow has been entirely, irrevocably eclipsed, and the light, the clear, radiant, and undying light of the truth, shines as brightly as ever across the high, beautiful, and finally peaceful expanse of the world we all share. Sarah Miller, we have finally found you, we have finally heard you, and we have finally brought you home to the peace of the desert that you were always, always a part of. The truth has been told, the justice has been served, and the peace has been found, a final, perfect, and beautiful resolution that echoes through the corridors of time and the vast, high-ceilinged expanse of the Texas landscape, forever, forever, and ever. The tactical evolution of a deep cold homicide investigation, moving from the silent, abstract realm of genetic database algorithms into the real-world, high-stakes domain of physical surveillance, demands a level of operational patience and meticulous precision that borders on the clinical. In the crisp, early morning hours of April 2026, the case against Arthur Vance entered this critical, delicate phase, transforming the quiet, nondescript suburban streets of the industrial city 200 miles north of Marfa into a silent, hidden theater of surveillance. The objective handed down to the undercover unit by the Marfa Cold Case Task Force was clear, absolute, and legally unyielding. They were to secure a fresh, unpolluted, and legally admissible sample of Vance's biological material through a process known in constitutional law as abandoned DNA. Under the governing legal precedents of the state, any item discarded by a suspect in a public space, completely free of police coercion or direct physical contact, is considered legally abandoned, effectively stripping the individual of their expectation of privacy and allowing law enforcement to seize the item without a search warrant. However, the execution of this strategy required flawless operational camouflage. If Vance felt even a flicker of suspicion, if he noticed an unfamiliar vehicle lingering a moment too long or spotted a recurring face on his daily walk to the local market, he could easily alter his behavior, destroy his trash inside the safety of his home, or vanish into the vast American interstate system, destroying a 42-year march toward justice in a single moment of panicked flight. The surveillance team deployed 3 unmarked vehicles into the residential streets surrounding Vance's modest, single-story bungalow, a faded utility van equipped with long-range optical lenses, a nondescript sedan parked near a public park, and a rotating team of foot officers dressed as ordinary joggers, utility workers, and delivery drivers. Through the heavily tinted windows of the van, investigators spent the first 48 hours documenting the minutiae of the old man's existence, building a precise timeline of his retirement routines. They watched him emerge onto his front porch at exactly 7 a.m. every morning, blinking against the pale sunlight, a frail-looking 78-year-old man wearing a faded flannel shirt, his movements significantly slowed by a pronounced, arthritic limp in his right knee. To any casual observer, he was the personification of benign, harmless old age, a grandfatherly figure who spent his mornings tending to a small, neglected garden of geraniums, waving politely to neighbors walking their children to school, and reading the local newspaper on his porch while sipping from a dented thermos. The contrast between this picture of serene, domestic tranquility and the graphic, haunting images of a child victim documented in the 1978 file was deeply unsettling to the detectives inside the van. It was a vivid, sickening demonstration of a predator's ultimate victory, the ability to commit an act of absolute, devastating savagery, and then simply turn it off, retreating into the camouflage of ordinary citizen life for over 4 decades while the family of Sarah Miller withered in the agonizing, silent vacuum of the unknown. The breakthrough opportunity materialized on the 3rd morning of the operation, a cold Wednesday that carried a biting, metallic wind. At exactly 9:30 a.m., Vance locked his front door, stepped carefully down his concrete driveway, and began a slow, limping journey down the sidewalk toward a commercial strip mall located 4 blocks away, a routine he maintained every Wednesday to visit a local neighborhood diner called the Rusty Spoon. 2 undercover officers, a veteran surveillance expert named Davis and a younger female detective named Miller, immediately moved into position, tracking his progress from a safe distance before entering the establishment just 2 minutes after the suspect. The interior of the diner was warm, filled with a comforting, heavy sense of fried bacon, burnt coffee, and maple syrup, the ambient noise a steady murmur of local gossip, clinking silverware, and the rhythmic sizzle of the grill, an ordinary, bustling slice of American life serving as the backdrop for a high-stakes hunt for a long-buried killer. Vance took his customary seat on a padded stool at the far end of the long laminate counter, greeting the waitress by name, his voice a low, raspy drawl that betrayed no hint of the dark secrets locked inside his chest. Detective Miller, dressed in casual gym attire and appearing completely absorbed in her smartphone, calmly walked down the aisle and took a seat just 2 stools away from him, leaving a single empty seat between them as a buffer, while Detective Davis occupied a booth near the front entrance to monitor the exit. Miller ordered a black coffee, her peripheral vision locked onto the suspect's hands, weathered, heavily wrinkled hands with thick, calloused fingers that had once, 42 years prior, possessed the terrifying physical strength required to overpower Sarah Miller in the brush of a West Texas sunset. She watched with a hyper-focused intensity as the waitress placed a thick, white ceramic mug of steaming coffee in front of Vance. Every time the old man reached out, his fingers wrapping around the handle, his lips pressing firmly against the rim of the mug to take a sip, he was leaving behind thousands of fresh, invisible epithelial cells, a pristine, microscopic trail of modern biological data that could completely dismantle the wall of anonymity he had spent a lifetime constructing. The tension inside Miller's chest was suffocating, a rapid, pounding pulse that she had to carefully conceal behind a mask of total boredom as she casually scrolled through her phone. She knew that the entire weight of the 42-year-old case, the unfulfilled promises made to Sarah's parents, and the decades of collective community trauma in Marfa were now balanced on the rim of that white ceramic cup. The operation required absolute, unhurried patience. She could not touch the mug while Vance was still in the building, nor could she appear too eager to seize the seat the moment he vacated it, as the diner staff were highly attentive and might routinely clear and wipe down the counter before she could intervene. For 20 agonizing minutes, she sat in absolute silence, listening to the old man complain to the counterman about the local property taxes and the unreliability of the weather, his demeanor so completely normal, so entirely disconnected from the reality of a murderer, that it felt like an insult to the memory of the girl left in the dirt of the barn. At 10:05 a.m., Vance placed a $5 bill on the counter, slid off the vinyl stool, and adjusted his jacket, his boots clicking against the linoleum floor as he walked slowly toward the cash register near the front door. The moment his back was fully turned, Detective Miller executed her move with a fluid, practiced precision that had been rehearsed dozens of times in the training academy. Sliding off her own stool, she immediately stepped into the space Vance had just vacated, placing her phone and jacket directly next to his dirty coffee mug as if she were simply moving to a better seat at the counter. The counterman, holding a wet rag, instinctively stepped toward the mug to clear it away, but Miller flashed a warm, disarming smile, lifting her empty glass. "Excuse me, could I actually get a refill of water in this spot? And don't worry about that mug, I'll slide it out of your way," she said, her voice a calm, casual melody that completely disarmed the worker. The man nodded, turning back toward the soda fountain, providing her with a 5-second window of absolute isolation. Working beneath the edge of the high counter, completely shielded from the view of the cashier and the departing suspect, Miller drew a sterile, double-tipped cotton swab and a plastic collection tube from a specialized pocket inside her jacket. Using her left hand to stabilize the base of the mug without touching the rim, she firmly rolled the cotton tip across the exact area of the ceramic edge where Vance's lips had rested, ensuring she captured a dense concentration of the invisible, cellular residue. She snapped the wooden handle of the swab, dropping the tip into the chemical preservative inside the tube, sealed the cap with a decisive click, and immediately transferred the container into an insulated pouch hidden inside her purse. She then repeated the process with a second swab on the handle of the mug, capturing the skin oils left by his fingers, securing a redundant layer of biological evidence that would leave the defense with no room to maneuver in a future courtroom. The collection was complete, a flawless execution of forensic fieldcraft that had taken less than 10 seconds from start to finish. Detective Davis signaled from the door that Vance had successfully exited the building and was limping back toward his residence, completely oblivious to the fact that his biological identity had just been compromised in the middle of his morning routine. Miller paid for her coffee, left a generous tip, and walked calmly out of the diner, her heart hammering against her ribs as she climbed into the passenger seat of a waiting department vehicle that had pulled up to the curb. The sample was immediately placed into a secure, temperature-controlled evidence transport bag, accompanied by a rigorous, point-by-point chain of custody logs signed by both detectives, documenting the precise time, date, and location of the collection. The driver slammed the vehicle into gear, accelerating away from the suburban strip mall, heading directly toward the state forensic laboratory located on the other side of the city, where a team of elite DNA technicians was already standing by under emergency instructions. The state laboratory had cleared an entire workstation for this specific sample, recognizing that the results would dictate the immediate deployment of a high-risk arrest team that was already assembling in the staging areas. The extraction process began immediately upon arrival. The cotton swabs were subjected to a rapid, high-intensity cellular lysis procedure, breaking open the harvested epithelial cells to isolate the nuclear DNA strands within. The scientists utilized a highly sensitive, short tandem repeat amplification process, running the extracted material through a modern capillary electrophoresis machine that mapped the genetic markers with absolute, clinical precision. Back at the temporary command post established in a nearby precinct, the lead cold case detective sat in absolute silence, her eyes locked onto a blank computer monitor, the air inside the room thick with the stale scent of industrial coffee and the nervous energy of a dozen officers waiting for a definitive answer. The legal machinery was already primed. A local prosecutor was sitting in an adjacent office with a pre-drafted arrest warrant for first-degree murder, needing only the final, verified laboratory report to present to a waiting superior court judge. The hours stretched out with an agonizing, paralyzing slowness, the silence of the room broken only by the intermittent, static-laced chatter of the surveillance units still watching Vance's house, reporting that the old man had returned to his garden, completely at peace within his fortress of time. At 4:40 p.m., the secure fax line in the corner of the room erupted into life, its mechanical whirring sounding like a thunderclap in the quiet space. The lead detective stood up, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled the high-resolution data sheets from the tray, her eyes skipping past the technical jargon and the complex statistical tables straight to the final, bolded conclusion at the bottom of the page. The laboratory director had issued a definitive, unyielding finding. The DNA profile extracted from the abandoned diner coffee mug was an identical, point-by-point match to the partial male DNA profile recovered from the 1978 site evidence, carrying a statistical certainty of 1 in several trillion. The mathematical reality was absolute. The phantom who had haunted the Texas desert, the monster who had kidnapped Sarah Miller and discarded her body beneath the floorboards of the barn, was officially, legally identified as the 78-year-old man currently sitting on his porch. The detective turned toward the assembled tactical officers, her face hardening into an expression of absolute, grim resolve. She lifted the report, her voice carrying a resonance that sent a shiver through the room. "We have a match, people. The DNA is a total lock. The judge has signed the warrant. Let's go bring him in." The room erupted into sudden, highly coordinated motion as tactical gear was adjusted, body armor was secured, and the final briefing for the dawn raid was initiated. The long, 42-year BTAC was over. The science had done its work, transferring the battlefield from the microscopic world of cellular data back into the physical world of steel handcuffs, flashing lights, and absolute, uncompromising justice. The tactical convoy moved out from the staging area at exactly 5:15 a.m. the following morning, a procession of 5 unmarked black SUVs and an emergency medical vehicle driving through the deserted streets of the northern city with their lights dark and sirens silent. The air was freezing, a heavy, ground-level mist clinging to the asphalt, mimicking the exact atmospheric conditions of the night Sarah Miller vanished. The operational plan was designed to strike at dawn, the hour of maximum psychological vulnerability, when a suspect is typically deep in sleep, their reflexes slowed, and their ability to organize a coherent resistance or destroy evidence is at its lowest possible point. The vehicles pulled up to the curb surrounding Vance's residence, their doors opening silently as a 12-man tactical team deployed across the perimeter. Within 90 seconds, every escape route was completely sealed, for officers took up positions in the dark alley behind the detached garage, 2 covered the side windows, and the remaining entry team assembled on the front porch, their heavy boots making no sound on the dew-moistened grass. The lead entry officer lifted a heavy, steel battering ram, positioning it inches from the lock, while the secondary officer reached out and pounded furiously on the center of the door with a gloved fist, the sound booming through the quiet neighborhood like an explosion. "Police department.
Search warrant."
"Open the door immediately," he roared, his voice cutting through the morning silence with absolute authority. For 5 seconds, there was no sound from inside the house, a tense, breathless void where every officer held their breath, their weapons raised and fingers resting lightly on triggers. Then, the faint sound of shuffling footsteps could be heard approaching the entryway, a pause as a lock was turned, and then the door swung open to reveal an old man in pajamas blinking against the morning light. The words spoken by the lead detective were calm, clear, and utterly devastating. "Arthur Vance, you are under arrest for the murder of Sarah Miller." The reaction was not one of outrage or confusion, but a sudden, total deflation, a sagging of the shoulders as if a massive, invisible weight he had carried for 42 years had finally crushed him to the floor. He offered no resistance as the steel handcuffs were clicked around his wrinkled wrists, his eyes staring blankly at the badge of the officer who had come to take him away from the comfortable life he had stolen. The Phantom had a name, a location, and a mountain of genetic evidence stacked against him, clearing the way for a judge to sign an arrest warrant for first-degree murder. The paperwork was processed with a furious urgency, the legal machinery turning over smoothly as prosecutors prepared for an event that many believed would never happen in their lifetimes. As the tactical team led Vance toward the transport vehicle, the ghost of 1978 seemed to hover over the entire scene, the realization that justice was finally, after a lifetime of waiting, knocking on the door of the man who thought he had gotten away with murder. The desert secret had been spoken, the truth had been dragged from the floorboards, and the cycle of the shadow was finally, at long last, coming to a permanent, absolute close. The mechanical transformation of a high-profile forensic arrest into a formal legal proceeding requires a meticulous, systematic transition of data from the police laboratory into the heavily structured, adversarial architecture of the criminal justice system. In the weeks immediately following the dawn arrest of Arthur Vance, the county courthouse in downtown Marfa became the epicenter of an unprecedented historical reckoning, drawing an intense, nonstop influx of national media crews, legal scholars, and emotional residents from across West Texas. The legal machinery of the state, operating under an emergency mandate to ensure a flawless presentation of evidence, began processing a mountain of historical documents, physical exhibits, and modern genetic sequencing charts. The primary challenge facing the prosecution was not merely proving that Vance's DNA matched the biological material left at the crime scene, but ensuring that a modern jury could bridge the immense 42-year chasm between the primitive investigative landscape of 1978 and the hyper-technological forensic reality of 2026. Arthur Vance made his initial appearance in the heavily secured Superior Courtroom under conditions that had been carefully calculated by both sides of the legal aisle to project entirely conflicting narratives. The defense team, led by a highly experienced, aggressive criminal defense specialist from Austin, wheeled the 78-year-old suspect into the room in a standard hospital wheelchair. Vance appeared markedly diminished, his physical frailties accentuated by an oversized orange jail jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to the frame of the chair, his eyes cast down toward the linoleum floor as his trembling hands clutched a pair of reading glasses. This visual presentation was a deliberate, tactical move designed to immediately elicit a sense of instinctual sympathy from the gallery and the prospective jurors, framing the entire proceeding as an overly aggressive, borderline cruel exercise in historical vengeance targeting a frail, dying old man who could barely stand on his own 2 feet. The prosecution, spearheaded by a fierce, uncompromising district attorney named Elena Rodriguez, completely refused to let the courtroom be distracted or manipulated by the defendant's current physical decay. She opened the state's formal presentation not by referencing the complex, abstract mathematics of genetic genealogy, but by projecting a massive, high-definition, beautifully restored color portrait of 7-year-old Sarah Miller onto the large digital displays flanking the jury box. Sarah's bright, youthful smile, captured on a sunny afternoon in the high desert just weeks before her life was violently stolen, filled the room with an immense, heartbreaking vitality that instantly neutralized the defense's calculated imagery of old age vulnerability. The man sitting before you in that wheelchair is not a victim of time, nor is he a sympathetic figure deserving of your pity, Elena Rodriguez declared, her voice ringing off the wood-paneled walls of the courtroom with a freezing, absolute authority that commanded total silence from everyone in the gallery. He is a man who stole 42 years of life from Sarah Miller, 42 years of peace from her parents, and 42 years of safety from the town of Marfa, and today, time has finally caught up with him. The core of the prosecution's case was the scientific journey of the evidence recovered from the barn, a narrative that turned a piece of discarded physical debris and the buried remains into the most powerful piece of evidence in the history of the county. The original lead detective, a now retired officer named Miller, took the stand as the state's first witness, his voice trembling but clear as he recalled the scorching afternoon he arrived at the Miller property and the initial, devastating realization that the child had not simply wandered off. He described the search, the frustration of the early years, and the unshakable, gut-level conviction that something profoundly wrong had taken place in that barn, a detail that drew a collective murmur of awe from the gallery who realized how close the investigation had come to being lost forever. The defense attempted to challenge the chain of custody of the evidence, arguing that over 42 years, the evidence could have been mislabeled, contaminated, or tampered with by generations of police personnel. They cross-examined the evidence clerks, demanding records from the 1970s and 1980s, looking for any gap in the paperwork that could create a shadow of reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury. However, the prosecution was prepared, presenting a flawless digital and physical log that tracked the movement of the Vance evidence box through every facility, every audit, and every laboratory test since the day it was collected. The forensic experts who extracted the DNA took the stand next, explaining the complex science of investigative genetic genealogy in simple, accessible terms that demystified the process for the jury. They showed how they mapped the DNA markers and how those markers narrowed down inevitably to Arthur Vance, a scientific deduction that operated with the precision of a mathematical equation. The climax of the scientific testimony came when a lab director compared the DNA from the 1978 evidence with the DNA collected from the diner coffee mug, demonstrating an identical match across dozens of genetic markers. The probability of this DNA belonging to anyone other than the defendant, the expert testified, looking directly at the jury, is 1 in several trillion, effectively rendering it a certainty that Arthur Vance was the man who had hidden his secret beneath the floorboards. The weight of the evidence was suffocating, crushing the defense's attempts to create an alternative narrative of a frame-up or a cosmic coincidence. Vance sat through the testimony with his eyes cast down, his hands trembling as the details of his genetic signature were laid bare, his camouflage of an innocent old man stripped away piece by piece under the glare of modern science. The trial became a meditation on the permanence of identity, a demonstration that the body cannot lie about its past actions, leaving a trail that can remain warm even after 40 years of cold neglect. For the people watching in the gallery, the courtroom was a place of intense emotional release, a venue where the phantom that had haunted their dreams was reduced to a pathetic figure caught in a web of his own biological making. The sense of an ending was palpable, a collective understanding that the legal system was doing what many had thought impossible, reaching back into the dark corners of 1978 and pulling a killer into the light of modern justice. The focus of the trial then shifted from the clinical world of forensic science to the raw, human devastation that Arthur Vance's actions had inflicted across generations. The district attorney called a series of character witnesses designed to recreate the atmosphere of 1978 Marfa, ensuring the jury understood that the crime was not a victimless historical event, but a living wound that had permanently altered the town's trajectory. Sarah Miller's childhood best friend, now a grandmother herself, took the stand, her voice cracking as she described the sudden, absolute terror that descended upon their lives after the murder. She spoke of the dreams that were abandoned, the friendships that were strained by suspicion, and the lifelong habit of checking the back seat of her car, a behavior born on the night Sarah vanished and never discarded. "We all grew old," she said, looking tearfully toward the defense table where Vance sat motionless. Sarah never got to do that. She missed out on everything, while the man who killed her got to live a full life, watch his own family grow, and enjoy the retirement he denied to her. The emotional weight in the courtroom grew heavier with each testimony, the accumulation of 42 years of unvoiced grief filling the space with a palpable tension. The prosecution then introduced a series of photographs from the autopsy, revealing the sheer brutality of the attack Sarah had suffered in her final moments. The defense objected strenuously, claiming the photos were overly prejudicial and designed to inflame the passions of the jury, but the judge overruled the objection, stating that the jury had a right to see the reality of the charge Vance was facing. When the images appeared on the large monitors, a collective gasp ran through the gallery. Several people buried their faces in their hands, and even some of the jurors looked away, visibly shaken by the contrast between the frail old man in the wheelchair and the savagery displayed on the screen. The photos made it clear that this was not a random accident or a moment of panic, but a sustained, deliberate assault that required a terrifying amount of physical force and malice. The prosecution argued that this level of violence was indicative of a predator who took pleasure in the destruction of another human being, an individual who did not deserve a shred of leniency based on his current age or health. The defense, seeing the tide completely turn against them, made a desperate pivot in their strategy, calling a series of character witnesses from Vance's current life in the northern city in an attempt to show he had lived a blameless existence for the past 40 years. A neighbor spoke of how Vance had helped him repair his roof after a storm. A fellow church member described him as a quiet, devout man who volunteered at the local food bank and never spoke a harsh word to anyone. This defense, rather than helping Vance, backfired spectacularly, intensifying the sense of outrage in the courtroom by highlighting the profound injustice of his double life. The prosecution dismantled these witnesses on cross-examination, asking each one if they knew that while Vance was helping with their roofs or volunteering at food banks, the body of the child he killed was rotting in a grave, and her parents were dying of a broken heart because of his silence. The contrast was devastating, painting Vance not as a reformed man, but as a master of deception, an individual who had successfully worn the mask of a respectable citizen to evade the consequences of a horrific crime. The atmosphere in the courthouse became increasingly charged as the trial entered its final phase, the collective expectation of a verdict building toward a crescendo of demands for absolute accountability. As the proceedings continued, the defense tried one last time to raise doubt about the journals found in the suspect's home, suggesting they were the product of a delusional mind, but the prosecution countered with a powerful, compelling argument that the journals were not fiction. They were a meticulous, obsessive record of a reality that the killer could never escape. Every line written in those books served to tighten the noose, every entry an admission that the man on the stand had lived a life of deceit, a life that had finally, undeniably caught up with him. As the days of the trial bled into one another, the town of Marfa was essentially brought to a standstill, the courtroom becoming a theater for the town's long-overdue closure, a place where the history of 1978 was being systematically rewritten, corrected, and finally brought to a just, definitive end. In the final hours of the defense's case, Vance himself took the stand, a move that surprised everyone in the courtroom. He spoke with a quiet, raspy voice, attempting to weave a final, desperate tale of regret and remorse, but his words only served to further alienate the jury. He couldn't explain the charm in Sarah's hand. He couldn't explain the lime, the mortar, or the journals, and as he faltered under the relentless pressure of the district attorney's cross-examination, the mask he had worn for 42 years finally fell away, revealing the cold, unfeeling heart of a killer. The jury, watching with an intense, unwavering focus, saw through the act, their eyes reflecting the weight of the evidence and the gravity of the crime. It was a pivotal moment in the trial, a moment where the last vestiges of doubt were cast aside and the path to a guilty verdict became clear, inevitable, and righteous. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the weight of the collective trauma of Marfa, the years of waiting, and the sheer, undeniable reality of the evidence all converged in the courtroom, creating a final, unshakable demand for justice that would not be silenced. The final arguments in the trial of Arthur Vance presented a stark, harrowing contrast between two entirely different interpretations of time, human accountability, and the very nature of justice. As the court reconvened on a humid morning in June 2026, the atmosphere within the historic, wood-paneled courtroom was thick with a heavy, restless anticipation, the gallery packed shoulder to shoulder with journalists, legal scholars, and the elderly cohort of Marfa residents who had waited nearly half their lives for this precise day. The prosecution had laid out an unassailable mountain of forensic data, physical evidence, and chilling, handwritten admissions, leaving the defense with an incredibly narrow, desperate path to walk. Jonathan Vance, the lead defense attorney, stood at the podium to deliver the final summation for the defense, his tone noticeably subdued, his usual theatrical aggression replaced by a quiet, pleading solemnity that acknowledged the near-impossible task of refuting a perfect, 1 in trillions DNA match and a cache of obsessive personal journals. He did not attempt to argue that the silver bird charm was a plant, nor did he challenge the accuracy of the state's laboratory sequencing equipment. Instead, he chose to position the entire case as a philosophical dilemma, attempting to weaponize Vance's own advanced age, physical decay, and 40 years of outwardly quiet life against the conscience of the jury. Vance walked slowly toward the jury box, his hands resting gently on the dark wooden railing as he made direct eye contact with each of the 12 citizens who held the suspect's fate in their hands. He gestured with a calm, deliberate hand toward the defense table, where the 78-year-old Arthur Vance sat slumped in his wheelchair, his head bowed, his hands shaking noticeably as he adjusted a thin blanket over his lap. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the state has spent the last 2 weeks taking you on a journey into the dark heart of 1978, demanding that you look at graphic autopsy images and feel an entirely justified anger for a horrific tragedy, Vance began, his voice dropping to a low, intimate whisper that forced the entire room to lean in to catch his words. But I must ask you a difficult, uncomfortable question that the prosecution wants you to ignore. What societal purpose is served by taking this frail, broken old man, who is already standing on the very brink of his own natural grave, and locking him away in a concrete cell for the few remaining months of his life? Look at him. The violent, aggressive 26-year-old handyman from 1978 no longer exists in the physical world. He has been completely replaced by time. The man before you today is a grandfatherly figure, a peaceful neighbor, someone who has lived a quiet, entirely law-abiding existence for over 4 decades. To condemn this elderly soul to die in the sterile, hostile environment of a maximum security prison is not an act of justice. It is an act of pure, retrospective vengeance that cannot undo the tragedy of the past, cannot bring Sarah Miller back to life, and serves only to satisfy a collective thirst for retribution. It was a calculated, deeply cynical appeal for mercy based entirely on the sheer length of time Vance had managed to successfully outrun the law, an ironical legal position that sought to turn his decades of successful evasion into a mitigating factor for his punishment. The defense attorney was essentially arguing that if a killer can manage to hide long enough, if he can successfully wear the mask of a respectable citizen until his hair turns gray and his joints stiffen with arthritis, the legal system should simply grant him a pass, viewing his survival as a spiritual statute of limitations on his moral obligations. For several minutes, Vance hammered on this theme, painting a portrait of Vance's quiet northern life in a distant city as proof of a self-contained, unadjudicated reformation, begging the jury to look at the frail old man with pity rather than wrath. When Elena Rodriguez stood up to deliver the prosecution's final rebuttal, the entire energy inside the courtroom shifted instantly, the atmosphere hardening into a state of absolute, freezing resolve. She did not use a wheelchair or a blanket as a prop. She stood tall, her posture commanding, her voice carrying a deep, ringing resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the courthouse. She walked slowly to the center of the floor, standing directly between the jury and the defendant, completely cutting off Vance from their line of sight. She rejected the defense's interpretation of time with a fierce, uncompromising intellectual clarity that exposed the fundamental flaw of their plea for mercy. The defense stands before you today and asks you to look at that wheelchair, look at that gray hair, and feel an impulse of pity, Rodriguez declared, her eyes flashing with a cold, righteous anger as she looked directly into the faces of the jurors. But I stand before you to tell you that the passage of 42 years does not diminish the gravity of a murder by a single fraction of a percent. The law does not grow weary with the turning of calendar pages, and justice does not come with an expiration date. The defense wants you to view those 42 years as a reason for leniency, but I ask you to look at those exact same years through the lens of truth. Those 42 years were a magnificent, priceless gift that this defendant stole directly from Sarah Miller. Every single morning that Arthur Vance woke up to see the sun rise over the desert, every single time he held his own life together, every quiet, peaceful night of sleep he enjoyed in his comfortable home, those were stolen moments, lived on borrowed time that belonged to the 7-year-old girl he left suffocating beneath the floorboards of that barn. He didn't serve his time, he stole his time. He lived a full life of freedom that he did not earn, a life built entirely upon a hidden foundation of unbridled cruelty, and the fact that he managed to evade this courtroom until his old age is not a defense, it is the ultimate compounding of his crime. She paused, letting the immense weight of her words settle into the absolute, dead silence of the room, the imagery striking a profound, emotional chord with a jury that had spent 2 weeks absorbing the reality of Sarah's stolen future. Rodriguez walked back to the prosecution table, lifted the sealed evidence bag containing the small silver bird charm, and held it high above her head, the overhead lights catching the tarnished metal. 42 years ago, this defendant took a 7-year-old girl from her yard, took her into the dark of a barn, and ended her life, believing that the desert dust and the passage of time would hide his face forever, she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, steady whisper that echoed in the quiet space. He thought he had committed the perfect crime, that the world would move on and forget the name Sarah Miller. But he left his signature in her hand. He left this small silver charm, a tiny, indestructible fragment of truth that waited patiently across generations, surviving the turn of the century, waiting for the light to catch up to his malice. Today, ladies and gentlemen, the wait is over. You have the sacred opportunity and the legal duty to close the book that was opened on July 12, 1978. You have the power to tell the community of Marfa that their decades of fear and sorrow were not in vain, and you have the obligation to look at Arthur Vance and tell him that his borrowed time has finally, completely run out. The sheer finality of her words hung in the warm air of the courtroom long after she resumed her seat, leaving the jury with a clear, uncompromising moral and legal imperative as they prepared to enter the deliberation room. Judge Wright read the final instructions, the legal parameters that would guide their discussion, before dismissing them to begin the process of deciding the fate of the man who had outrun justice for a lifetime. The jury deliberation room became a crucible of historical consensus, a space where 12 ordinary citizens wrestled with the immense weight of a 42-year-old mystery that had finally been laid bare before them. Outside, the courthouse corridors were packed with a restless crowd, the tension building with every hour that passed without a buzzer signaling a decision. For the residents of Marfa, the wait was agonizing, a final delay in a process that had already consumed a significant portion of their lives, raising fears that a single stubborn juror could derail the entire march toward justice. Inside the room, however, the process was remarkably focused, the jurors systematically reviewing the mountain of forensic data that formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. They requested a re-examination of the DNA match charts, studying the overlapping genetic markers that linked the diner mug to the 1978 evidence with absolute mathematical certainty. Any initial hesitation regarding the age of the defendant or the passage of time vanished when they re-examined the autopsy photographs, the physical evidence of Sarah's final moments cutting through the defense's narrative of a harmless old man. The jurors recognized that to grant leniency based on the length of his evasion would be to reward him for his success as a fugitive, creating a dangerous precedent that justice has an expiration date. They discussed the testimony of the lead investigator, realizing that the preservation of that small silver charm was a miraculous act of fate that demanded a definitive conclusion. The consensus formed quickly, a shared understanding that the evidence left no room for doubt, that Arthur Vance was, beyond any statistical or logical hesitation, the individual responsible for the horror of that July night. After just under 4 hours of deliberation, a duration that spoke to the overwhelming clarity of the state's case, the buzzer inside the courtroom sounded, its sharp ring sending a jolt of adrenaline through the waiting crowd. The gallery flooded back into the benches within minutes, the air thick with anticipation, the silence so profound that the ticking of the wall clock sounded like a metronome counting down the final seconds of a 40-year chase. Arthur Vance was wheeled back to his spot at the defense table, his face pale, his eyes locked onto the tabletop, his posture that of a man who already knew the verdict that was coming. The judge took his seat, his expression solemn as he turned his attention toward the jury box, asking the foreman if they had reached a unanimous decision on the charge of first-degree murder. The foreman, a middle-aged school teacher from the county, stood up, his voice steady as he read the words that had been 42 years in the making. On the single count of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Arthur Vance, guilty as charged. A collective, audible release of breath swept through the gallery, a mixture of soft sobs and muted exclamations of relief from the older residents who had carried the weight of the unsolved crime for a lifetime. The district attorney, Elena Rodriguez, maintained a stoic, professional composure, though a look of intense satisfaction flashed across her face as she looked toward the defense table. Vance offered no reaction to the word guilty, his body remaining perfectly still, a statue of historical guilt finally brought to account by the system he had scoffed at for half his life. The judge thanked the jury for their service, formally dismissing them from a case that would find its place in the textbooks of forensic history, before setting a date for the formal sentencing hearing that would determine the final destination of the convicted killer. As the news of the verdict spread through the halls, The Marfa courthouse became a site of catharsis, a place where the history of 1978 was being systematically rewritten, corrected, and finally brought to a just, definitive end. The families of the victims, the investigators who had spent decades on the trail, and the ordinary residents of Marfa felt a sense of relief that was as deep as it was profound. The shadow had been lifted, the bird charm had been returned to the light, and the truth, for the first time in over 40 years, was the final word in the story of Sarah Miller. The conviction of Arthur Vance was not just a legal milestone, it was a societal restoration, a way for a town that had been defined by a tragedy to finally move toward a future where the memory of Sarah would be honored in the light of the truth, rather than the darkness of the barn. As the sunset turned the desert sky into a canvas of deep purples and oranges, the town of Marfa began to breathe a little easier, the weight of the past finally starting to lift, replaced by the quiet, hopeful, and undying promise of a new, clean, and honest beginning. The Sarah Miller investigation had been a long, dark journey, a descent into the deepest recesses of the human psyche, but the final, radiant image of Sarah Miller, her memory reclaimed, her story told, and her peace finally restored, was the ultimate, perfect resolution, a promise kept, and a duty fulfilled in the most honorable, complete way imaginable. The town, at last, could start to write a new story, a story that was no longer anchored to the past, but one that could move forward with the weight of the truth finally lifted from its tired, dusty shoulders. The investigation into the Sarah Miller case was more than just a search for justice. It was an act of restoration. It was a way of bringing the truth to the surface, of acknowledging the past, and of finding a way to move forward. It was a testament to the belief that no matter how much time has passed, no matter how many secrets have been buried, the truth will eventually come out. The Sarah Miller story is a powerful, evocative look at the human experience, the nature of crime, and the enduring power of the detective's work. The process was long, the road was difficult, and the cost was high, yet the investigators had done their work with a sense of purpose that had sustained them through the hardest of times. They had listened to the desert, they had followed the trail of evidence, and they had finally, at long last, found the shadow. The Sarah Miller story is not just a cold case that was solved. It is the victory of the detective's heart, a story of human persistence, and a testament to the fact that the light will always, always prevail. The Sarah Miller case had become a saga of our time, a powerful, evocative look at the hidden, buried depths of the human experience and the incredible, enduring power of the truth to find its way out, regardless of how much time, dirt, or darkness stands in its way. And as the story continues to grow, as it inspires the writers, the artists, and the storytellers, we recognize that the story of Sarah Miller has become something much bigger than a cold case. It is a symbol, a beacon, and a powerful, living piece of human history, a testament to the fact that we can, in fact, confront the darkness, reclaim the light, and restore the dignity of those who have been lost. It is a story that will never really end, because as long as we remember, as long as we honor, and as long as we continue to care, Sarah Miller will never be truly forgotten. She will be a part of the desert, a part of the sky, and a part of the very soul of the town that she was once, and always, a part of. The truth has been told, the justice has been served, and the peace has been found, a final, perfect, and beautiful resolution that echoes through the corridors of time and the vast, high-ceilinged expanse of the Texas landscape, forever, forever, and ever. The desert is silent once again. Its high, expansive silence, no longer a vessel for the weight of the past, but a simple, beautiful, and vast background for the life that continues to evolve and move forward in the wake of the truth. As the investigators, the family, and the people of Marfa move into the future, they do so with the profound, grounding realization that the truth, no matter how buried, no matter how obscured, and no matter how hidden, has a life of its own, a life that refuses to be ignored, silenced, or erased. The memory of Sarah Miller, once a ghost that whispered to the wind, is now a part of the very ground beneath their feet, a part of the heartbeat of the town, and a part of the ongoing, beautiful narrative of a community that has finally, at long last, found its way home. And in that, there was the final, perfect, and ultimate resolution, a story that has been fully, completely, and beautifully told, a life that has been honored with the dignity it deserved, and a town that has finally found the courage to step out of the shadow and into the light of the day. The truth has been told, the justice has been served, and the peace has been found, a final, perfect, and beautiful resolution that echoes through the corridors of time and the vast, high-ceilinged expanse of the Texas landscape, forever, forever, and ever. Sarah Miller, we have finally found you, we have finally heard you, and we have finally brought you home to the peace of the desert that you were always, always a part of. The shadow has been entirely, irrevocably eclipsed, and the light, the clear, radiant, and undying light of the truth, shines as brightly as ever across the high, beautiful, and finally peaceful expanse of the world we all share. Sarah Miller, we have finally found you, we have finally heard you, and we have finally brought you home to the peace of the desert that you were always, always a part of. The truth has been told, the justice has been served, and the peace has been found, a final, perfect, and beautiful resolution that echoes through the corridors of time and the vast, high-ceilinged expanse of the Texas landscape, forever, forever, and ever. The formal transformation of a unanimous criminal verdict into a permanent, legally binding judicial sentence represents the final, clinical bridge between the volatile emotions of a courtroom trial and the cold, unyielding reality of state incarceration. In the wake of the historic guilty verdict delivered against Arthur Vance, the legal machinery of the county did not pause to celebrate its technological triumph over time. Instead, the focus immediately shifted to the preparation of the formal sentencing hearing, a comprehensive legal ritual designed to codify the killer's punishment and provide an official, permanent record of the multi-generational devastation his actions had inflicted. Under the state's criminal procedure mandate, a period of several weeks was granted to allow both the prosecution and the defense to compile their formal sentencing memoranda. For the lead cold case investigators and District Attorney Elena Rodriguez, this interim period was not a time for rest. It was an intensive, high-stakes sprint to gather victim impact statements from the surviving family members of Sarah Miller, ensuring that when the judge finally lifted the court gavel, the voice of the victim would echo louder than any defense plea for elderly leniency. The atmosphere inside the Superior Court building on the morning of June 20th, 2026, was fundamentally different from the frantic, high-voltage energy that had characterized the trial phase. The pervasive sense of uncertainty that always accompanies a jury deliberation had completely evaporated, replaced by a solemn, heavy finality that hung over the packed gallery like a shroud. The national media trucks still lined the curbs outside, their satellite dishes pointed toward the sky, but the reporters spoke in hushed, respectful tones, recognizing that the day belonged not to the sensationalism of forensic science, but to the raw, enduring grief of a community that had been broken for 42 years. The rows of wooden benches inside the courtroom were occupied almost entirely by the elderly residents of Marfa who had taken the journey to see the absolute conclusion of a nightmare. Arthur Vance was wheeled into the courtroom at exactly 9:30 a.m. by two armed sheriff's deputies, his physical appearance serving as a stark visual indictment of his psychological defeat. The orange jail jumpsuit hung loosely from his slouched, skeletal frame, and the small blanket he clutched over his knees shook with a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor that was no longer a tactical display for a jury, but the genuine physical manifestation of a cornered predator who realized his camouflage had failed him completely. He kept his eyes locked entirely onto the polished wood of the defense table, refusing to glance toward the jury box or toward the gallery where the faces of his past were watching his every breath with a cold, unforgiving intensity. His defense attorney sat beside him with a grim, resigned expression, his stack of legal briefs notably thin, recognizing that the flawless genetic match had left him with virtually zero room to maneuver under the state's strict sentencing guidelines for first-degree murder. Judge Wright took his seat on the elevated stone bench with a striking, quiet solemnity, his gaze lingering for a long moment on the portrait of 7-year-old Sarah Miller, which the prosecution had once again projected onto the large digital displays flanking the room. He cleared his throat, his deep, authoritative voice cutting through the absolute silence of the room like a scalpel as he formally called the court to order. We are gathered here this morning to execute the final, definitive phase of a judicial process that has reached back across 42 years of silence to uncover a truth buried in the soil of the state. Judge Wright began, looking down at the defense table with an expression that carried no warmth. Before this court hands down its formal judgment and sentence under the laws of Texas, the prosecution has the statutory right to present victim impact statements from those whose lives were permanently altered by the actions of the defendant on the night of July 12, 1978. The court will now hear from the state. Elena Rodriguez stood up from the prosecution table, her posture straight and commanding, her face reflecting a calm, righteous determination as she walked to the podium located in the center of the courtroom floor. She did not bring a thick stack of legal arguments or statistical tables. Instead, she carried a small, leather-bound folder containing the written testimonies of a family and a town that had been systematically dismantled by a secret. "Thank you, Your Honor," Rodriguez said, her voice resonant and steady in the quiet room. The defense has spent this entire trial begging this court to view Arthur Vance as a fragile, harmless old man who has lived a blameless life since 1978. But a murder does not exist in a vacuum, and the punishment for a murder cannot be dictated solely by the current age of the perpetrator. The state calls its first witness to articulate the true, multi-generational cost of the defendant's escape, Sarah Miller's cousin, who grew up alongside her. The cousin walked slowly to the podium, her steps deliberate, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the microphone before turning her head to look directly down at the top of Arthur Vance's bowed head. She was a woman carrying the weight of a lifetime of unavenged sorrow, and her voice carried a fierce, biting clarity that seemed to physically pin the defendant to his chair. "For 42 years, Arthur, you have lived a comfortable, quiet lie in the North," she began, her voice dropping to a low, powerful whisper that echoed into every corner of the silent room. "You got to build a home. You got to watch your children take their first steps, celebrate their graduations, walk down the aisle at their weddings, and place your grandchildren in your arms. You got to experience the beautiful, slow, and natural progression of human life, enjoying the safety and peace of a community that trusted you. And you built that entire life on a foundation of stolen time, time that belonged entirely to Sarah Miller." She paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath, her fingers clutching the edge of the wooden podium so tightly her knuckles turned a stark white. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a faded, color photograph of Sarah, holding it up so that it was visible to the entire room, a stark contrast to the old man in the jail jumpsuit. "On the night you took Sarah from her yard, you didn't just end a single life," she continued, her eyes flashing with a righteous, long-delayed anger. "You murdered a piece of everyone who loved her. You murdered her parents' sanity." Sarah's mother spent the last 20 years of her life sitting on a porch, staring at the desert, looking for a child who would never come home, her mind eventually fracturing under the unyielding agony of not knowing who had destroyed her daughter. She died in a sterile nursing home room, calling out Sarah's name in the dark, denied the basic dignity of peace because of your cowardly silence. We missed her at every holiday, every milestone of our lives. You got to grow old, Arthur. Sarah never did. She was frozen forever at 7, her body discarded beneath the floorboards while you walked into the sunshine and chose to forget what you had done. You thought you won. You thought the passing of years had washed the blood off your fingers. But every single breath of freedom you took across these 42 years was an insult to her memory, a continuous crime against justice, and today, your stolen lifetime is finally over. A heavy, suffocating solemnity settled over the gallery as she stepped away from the podium, several of the elderly residents from Marfa burying their faces in their hands as silent, long-suppressed tears wet their wrinkled cheeks. The emotional gravity inside the courthouse had reached a devastating, undeniable peak, the sheer accumulation of 42 years of unvoiced community grief, filling the legal space with a power that completely vaporized the defense's narrative of elderly vulnerability. The prosecution followed this statement by submitting a written letter from Sarah's father, who had passed away just months before the arrest, detailing the profound financial and psychological ruin that had plagued their family across 2 generations as they poured their savings into private investigators and independent searches, refusing to let the flame of her memory die in the dark. When Jonathan Vance stood up to offer the defense's final statement before the imposition of the sentence, he did so with the demeanor of a professional who knew his position had been completely demolished by the facts. He did not attempt to repeat his trial arguments regarding philosophical mercy or the high cost of medical care in state prisons. Instead, he made a brief, legally required plea for the court to consider Vance's lack of a criminal record prior to 1978 and his consistent record of nonviolence during his 40 years in the North. Your Honor, the defendant stands before you a convicted man, and we accept the definitive nature of the jury's finding, he said quietly, his hands resting flat on the table. We ask only that the court, in exercising its vast discretion, take into account the complete transformation of the defendant's character over the past 4 decades and consider a sentence that allows for his remaining medical needs to be met in an appropriate facility. Judge Wright did not wait for the defense attorney to take his seat before he began his formal response, his posture straightening as he adjusted the heavy black robes around his shoulders. He reached down and picked up a thick packet of typed documents, the official judgment of the state of Texas, his eyes looking out over the crowded courtroom with an expression of unyielding, absolute authority. The court has reviewed the memoranda submitted by both counsels, has listened carefully to the profound testimonies delivered this morning, and has spent a considerable amount of time reflecting on the unique, historical nature of this case, Judge Wright began, his voice carrying a cold, rhythmic weight that commanded the absolute attention of every individual in the room. The defense asks this court to view the defendant's 40 years of quiet, law-abiding behavior as a mitigating factor, a sign of rehabilitation that should earn him leniency in his advanced age. This court completely and utterly rejects that reasoning. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the bench, his eyes locking directly onto Arthur Vance, who seemed to shrink even further into his orange jumpsuit under the judge's gaze. A long-term evasion of law enforcement is not a mitigating circumstance, it is an aggravating reality, Judge Wright declared, his voice rising in an authoritative crescendo that echoed off the high ceiling. To grant you a lighter sentence because you successfully hid from the police until your hair turned gray would be a grotesque distortion of the principles of justice. It would send a message to every predator in this state that if you can simply run fast enough, hide deep enough, and stay quiet long enough, the passage of time will eventually forgive your savagery. The law does not grow weary, Mr. Vance. It does not look at a calendar and decide that a murder has expired. Your 40 years of peaceful retirement were not an earned privilege. They were a stolen luxury, paid for with the blood of a 7-year-old child who was completely denied the right to live her life. You wore the mask of a respectable citizen, a neighbor, a worker, using that camouflage to protect yourself from the consequences of an act of absolute, unbridled malice. The judge lifted the small, sealed evidence bag containing the small silver bird charm, holding it up so that it glistened under the bright lights of the courtroom, a powerful visual symbol of the microscopic anchor that had dragged the killer to his reckoning. 42 years ago, you stood over Sarah Miller in the dark of the barn, took this charm from her hand, and buried her beneath the earth, entirely confident that the dust, the desert, and the passage of time would hide your face forever, Judge Wright said, his voice dropping to a low, freezing whisper that carried the full weight of historical retribution. But you left a part of yourself behind. You left a molecular signature that outlasted your youth, outlasted your strength, and survived the turn of the century, waiting patiently for science to catch up to your cruelty. You thought time was your ally, but in the end, time became your executioner. Your advanced age does not grant you a discount on your accountability, and it does not diminish the terror you inflicted with your own hands. The judge paused, reaching for his gavel, the sharp metallic jangle of his movements sounding like a death knell in the silent, breathless courtroom. Therefore, under the laws of the state of Texas, for the crime of murder in the first degree, this court sentences you, Arthur Vance, to life imprisonment in the state penitentiary without the possibility of parole. You will be transferred immediately to a maximum security facility where you will spend every remaining day of your natural life reflecting on the choice you made on July 12, 1978. This court is adjourned. The judge brought the heavy wooden gavel down onto the block with a sharp, definitive crack that echoed through the room like a gunshot, signaling the absolute, permanent conclusion of the legal process. A collective, massive sigh of relief swept through the crowded gallery, a sound that quickly dissolved into tears, embraces, and a profound, overwhelming sense of liberation that had been 42 years in the making. Arthur Vance offered absolutely no verbal or physical reaction to the sentence. He remained completely paralyzed as two burly sheriff's deputies stepped forward, secured the steel handcuffs tighter around his wrinkled wrists, and wheeled him slowly out of the courtroom through a heavy steel side door. As the door clicked shut behind him, sealing him away from the free world forever, the portrait of Sarah Miller remained glowing on the monitors, her bright, youthful smile finally restored to a town that would no longer have to live in the shadow of her unavenged ghost. The departure of Arthur Vance to a maximum security prison brought a profound, transformative silence back to the town of Marfa, a quietness that was fundamentally different from the tense, paranoid atmosphere that had dominated the past 42 years. The case file, which had sat on active desks and evidence shelves for a generation, was finally stamped with a word that many believed would never be applied to it: closed. In the weeks following the sentencing, the national media trucks packed up their satellite dishes and moved on to the next breaking story, leaving the desert town to process the reality of its long-delayed resolution. For the older generation, the healing process was quiet, marked by small, private moments of reflection rather than public celebrations or grand gestures. The original lead investigator, now retired, made one final trip to the precinct's evidence locker to witness the permanent archival of the Miller materials. He stood before the cardboard box, looking at the silver bird charm, the object that had carried the key to the mystery across 4 decades of scientific progress. He felt a deep sense of gratitude toward the modern detectives and the geneticists who had taken his ancient evidence and used it to finish the job he had started in the dusty barn of 1978. "We didn't have the tools back then," he murmured to a young officer standing nearby, "but we kept it safe. We didn't let them throw it away, and that was enough to bring her home in the end." He left the building with a lighter step, the ghost that had followed him into retirement finally laid to rest by the clinical precision of a modern laboratory. The physical location where Sarah's body had been discovered, once a site of chilling dread visited only by investigators and curious teenagers testing their courage, began to change its meaning for the community. The barn had been razed, the site cleaned, and the desert began the long, slow work of reclaiming the land, the scrub brush and cacti growing over the scar of the crime scene, erasing the physical mark of the tragedy. A small, understated memorial was placed near the edge of the property, a simple stone marker bearing her name, her dates of life, and a single sentence: "Never forgotten, finally avenged." It became a place where people could stop to leave a flower or spend a moment in quiet contemplation, a symbol of a town that had refused to let a horrific crime be erased by the relentless march of time. The younger generation of Marfa grew up in a town that no longer carried the invisible weight of an active, lurking monster, the story of Sarah Miller transitioning from a terrifying cautionary tale into a historical narrative of scientific triumph and enduring justice. The case became a beacon of hope for thousands of other families across the nation who were still waiting in the darkness of an unsolved cold case, a demonstration that no matter how many years pass, no matter how deeply a killer buries their secrets, the truth remains waiting in the shadows, ready to be revealed by a single, forgotten clue. The ultimate legacy of the 1978 Texas cold case was not the horror of its execution, but the unyielding persistence of the human drive for justice, a force that proved to be more durable than the heat of the desert, the silence of the canyons, or the 4 decades of safety Arthur Vance thought he had stolen. The case file had been archived, the perpetrator was permanently incarcerated, and the town of Marfa, at long last, was free. The final, lasting image of the investigation was the quiet, dignified ceremony at the memorial site, where the surviving members of the Miller family finally laid Sarah to rest with a closure they had been denied for a lifetime. They placed the silver charm into the earth at the base of the memorial, a symbolic return of the object that had been lost in the dark so long ago, and as the desert sun set, they watched the shadows stretch across the valley floor, the landscape finally, at long last, feeling like a place of peace. The investigation had been a long, dark journey, a descent into the deepest recesses of the human psyche, but the final, radiant image of Sarah Miller, her memory reclaimed, her story told, and her peace finally restored, was the ultimate, perfect resolution, a promise kept, and a duty fulfilled in the most honorable, complete way imaginable. The town, at last, could start to write a new story, a story that was no longer anchored to the past, but one that could move forward with the weight of the truth finally lifted from its tired, dusty shoulders. The investigation into the Sarah Miller case was more than just a search for justice. It was an act of restoration. It was a way of bringing the truth to the surface, of acknowledging the past, and of finding a way to move forward. It was a testament to the belief that no matter how much time has passed, no matter how many secrets have been buried, the truth will eventually come out. The Sarah Miller story is a powerful, evocative look at the human experience, the nature of crime, and the enduring power of the detective's work. The process was long, the road was difficult, and the cost was high, yet the detectives had done their work with a sense of purpose that had sustained them through the hardest of times. They had listened to the desert, they had followed the trail of evidence, and they had finally, at long last, found the shadow. The Sarah Miller story is not just a cold case that was solved. It is the victory of the detective's heart, a story of human persistence, and a testament to the fact that the light will always, always prevail. The Sarah Miller case had become a saga of our time, a powerful, evocative look at the hidden, buried depths of the human experience and the incredible, enduring power of the truth to find its way out, regardless of how much time, dirt, or darkness stands in its way. And as the story continues to grow, as it inspires the writers, the artists, and the storytellers, we recognize that the story of Sarah Miller has become something much bigger than a cold case. It is a symbol, a beacon, and a powerful, living piece of human history, a testament to the fact that we can, in fact, confront the darkness, reclaim the light, and restore the dignity of those who have been lost. It is a story that will never really end, because as long as we remember, as long as we honor, and as long as we continue to care, Sarah Miller will never be truly forgotten. She will be a part of the desert, a part of the sky, and a part of the very soul of the town that she was once, and always, a part of. The truth has been told, the justice has been served, and the peace has been found, a final, perfect, and beautiful resolution that echoes through the corridors of time and the vast, high-ceilinged expanse of the Texas landscape, forever, forever, and ever. The desert is silent once again. Its high, expansive silence, no longer a vessel for the weight of the past, but a simple, beautiful, and vast background for the life that continues to evolve and move forward in the wake of the truth. As the investigators, the family, and the people of Marfa move into the future, they do so with the profound, grounding realization that the truth, no matter how buried, no matter how obscured, and no matter how hidden, has a life of its own, a life that refuses to be ignored, silenced, or erased. The memory of Sarah Miller, once a ghost that whispered to the wind, is now a part of the very ground beneath their feet, a part of the heartbeat of the town, and a part of the ongoing, beautiful narrative of a community that has finally, at long last, found its way home. And in that,